It was a rainy night in October. Wind beat against the windows. Street lights blurred in the sheets of water. At 10:15 p.m., Lisa Tran left her shift at the market. She carried a canvas bag with nearly $18,000. She was supposed to drive 3 miles and hand it to the bank. The security camera at the store caught her under a thin raincoat, head down, moving steady. Then the frame went black. She vanished into the storm. Lisa was 26. She lived alone in a small apartment 10 minutes away. She worked nights to pay tuition and to send money home to her mother. Friends called her quiet and reliable. She kept to herself. A few weeks earlier, she argued with her ex about money. She had clashed once with her manager over how the till was handled. Small fights, nothing that looked like danger. Still, those small things left traces. That evening, the rain smeared everything. Cameras along the route were streaked and blurry. At 10:05, she opened the safe. At 10:15, she walked to her car. At 10:22, a private camera caught a washed-out Sheikh drive past. No calls. Her phone went silent through the night. By morning, her car was abandoned 3 miles from the market. The keys were in the ignition. The money was gone. There were no signs of a struggle in the vehicle. The rain had wiped away most clues. Police sealed off the roads. Search teams combed the dark banks and wooded ditches. Dogs worked through the wet. Volunteers pasted flyers in the rain. Witness statements arrived thin and uncertain. 3 names surfaced in interviews: Jake, the ex; Tom, the coworker who last said he saw her; Richard, the night manager who handled the deposits. Each had holes in their story. Each became a focus of suspicion. But nothing stuck. Months turned to years. The case cooled. Posters faded on lampposts. The town learned to speak Lisa's name in the past tense. Then, nearly a decade later, technology moved forward. Small fibers and a single hair, once blurred by rain, were analyzed with new tools. DNA matched a man people trusted. The discovery did not make the town feel safer. It made them feel betrayed. This is Lisa Tran. She was 26. She lived alone in a small apartment 10 minutes from the market. She worked nights as a cashier. She worked to pay tuition and to send money home to her mother. She kept to herself. Friends called her steady and responsible. Her life looked ordinary. Her routine was not. Her shift ended the same way most nights. She counted the till. She sealed the canvas deposit bag. She locked the safe. The deposit run was part of the job. She followed the same route to the bank. She left work after closing, drove the same wet roads, and returned home with a paycheck that went straight to her mother. That pattern was why people in town trusted her. That pattern is also why the night she vanished feels so wrong. A few weeks before she disappeared, she argued with an ex over money. She had also disagreed with her manager about how cash was handled. Those were small fights. They did not look like real danger when they happened. Detectives later logged them anyway. Routine matters. Routes matter. Schedules matter. On a rainy October night, she finished her shift. It was a heavy rain. The security camera at the market shows her at 10:05 p.m. opening the safe. The footage shows her at 10:15 walking across the lot under a thin raincoat, the canvas bag folded over her arm. A private driveway camera farther down the road shows a washed-out shape at 10:22 p.m. After that, the trail goes quiet. Her phone went silent through the night. By morning, her car sat abandoned 3 miles from the market. The keys were in the ignition. The deposit bag with nearly $18,000 was gone. There were no clear signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. The rain had blurred and washed away a lot of possible evidence. The scene left more questions than answers. The police locked down the area and launched a search. Dogs tracked wet footprints along the shoulder. Volunteers taped flyers to lampposts in the rain. Witness statements were thin and uncertain. Cameras along the route were streaked with water. One private camera recorded a vehicle, but the image was too unclear to identify a driver. There were no bank transactions after the night. No CCTV captured a hand taking the bag. For weeks, the investigation focused on interviews and small traces. 3 names emerged in early interviews: Jake, the ex-boyfriend; Tom, the coworker who said he'd seen her leave; Richard, the night manager who signed off on the deposit. Each name filled headlines. Each name carried holes in their story. Jake had a history of fights. He and Lisa had split after arguments about money. Neighbors said he became withdrawn after the disappearance. He left town weeks later under pressure. Tom was the last person to claim he saw Lisa at the lot. His initial statements shifted when police pressed him. His alibi was weak. Richard handled the till procedures and had argued with staff over cash counts. He was under financial strain at the time, according to coworkers. Detectives questioned all 3. They collected alibis and checked phone records. Nothing proved any of them guilty. Public suspicion grew anyway. The town turned loud. Social media named suspects. Conversations in cafes turned to accusations. Jake found himself avoided on the street. Tom lost his job. Richard started drinking more. Families felt the strain of being suspected. The glare of suspicion changed lives long before the case reached any conclusion. Still, the official file went cold. Months stretched into years. Posters on telephone poles faded. The case slid into the files labeled unresolved. Then the file moved again. Nearly a decade later, advances in forensic science reopened the investigation. New testing could analyze fibers and tiny biological traces that earlier technology could not. Police returned to the car, the seat fabric, and a pair of wet boots found 400 meters from the scene. A single hair that had once been Investigators dug into his records. Financials showed gambling debts and unpaid loans. His shift logs placed him on duty the night Lisa disappeared. A review of the bank's security system showed gaps and blind spots at the time. Forensic scientists reported that the fabric fragment matched fibers on a raincoat in Allen's possession. The DNA on the hair and on a cloth found near where a body was later discovered matched Allen's profile. The discovery came with a new, grim lead. After a storm, when water levels dropped in a drainage culvert by the river, remains were found. Forensic examination linked the remains to Lisa through dental records and personal items. The same DNA trace that had matched Allen was present on clothing fragments taken from that site. The quiet man who patrolled the bank now appeared on the other side of the evidence table. Arrest followed the scientific match. The charges centered on the disappearance and on the theft of the deposit. The case depended on the chain of forensic evidence: the hair, the fabric, the fiber comparisons, the financial motive, and the timeline that placed Allen near the route he knew well. The prosecution presented the sequence in court with a focus on material links. The defense raised doubt about contamination and the limits of testing done on samples exposed to weather. The trial turned on whether the scientific ties and circumstantial timeline met the legal standard. Throughout the proceedings, the community watched old biases confronted by hard data. The three men who had once been the focus of rumor, Jake, Tom, and Richard, were cleared of criminal responsibility after the evidence led elsewhere. Their lives, however, had already been altered by suspicion. Families dealt with lost jobs, fractured marriages, and reputations that took years to recover. For Lisa's mother, the discovery of remains and the arrest brought two outcomes at once: confirmation and pain. Confirmed that her daughter would not return. Pain at the details that followed. For investigators, the case was a reminder that small traces can hide in the wash of weather. Rain will blur a camera and erase footprints. It cannot erase DNA found in a hair or the weave pattern of a jacket fiber that matches. This story is about a routine that went wrong. It is about how a deposit run and a rainy night exposed a fault line in a town's trust. It is about three names drawn into suspicion and one name that, years later, matched the science. It is a record of methods, interviews, timelines, forensic advances, and of the slow, patient work that turned a cold case into a discovery. The facts are simple and stark. A woman left work. She did not return. Small pieces of evidence survived the weather, and those pieces led to an answer the town had long sought. If you want to keep listening, we will move next to the moment-by-moment timeline of the disappearance, and the exact pieces of evidence that tied a guard on the night shift to the route Lisa walked. The night was heavy with rain. Wind pushed water across the parking lot and blurred the streetlights. At 10:05 p.m., Lisa Tran opened the safe and prepared the deposit bag. At 10:15, she walked out of the market under a thin raincoat, the canvas bag folded over her arm. A private camera farther down the road recorded a washed-out shape at 10:22 p.m. After that, the trail went quiet. Her routine was simple and predictable. She lived alone, 10 minutes from work. She worked late shifts as a cashier. She counted the till, sealed the bag, and drove the same route to the bank. That route, that schedule, was known by coworkers and the bank staff. It should have been safe. A few weeks before the night she vanished, there were small disputes. She argued with an ex about money. She had a sharp disagreement with a manager over cash counts. Those incidents were recorded in interviews later. They did not amount to a threat on their own. Still, they became pieces investigators would revisit. The rain mattered. It blurred cameras and washed away traces. Roadside CCTV showed streaks of water across the lens. Witness statements were thin and uncertain. One coworker, Tom, told detectives, "I saw her head down, soaked through, but she walked steady." That was the last I remember. His voice would be replayed many times in interviews and on the stand. At first, the timeline was straightforward. 22:05, the safe. 22:15, she leaves the lot. 22:22, a crude image captured on a private driveway camera. After that, silence. Her phone did not ring through the night. There were no card transactions after closing. By morning, her car sat abandoned 3 miles from the market. The keys remained in the ignition. The deposit bag, containing nearly $18,000, was gone. Inside the vehicle, there were no obvious signs of a struggle. Detectives moved fast in the hours after discovery. Officers sealed the scene. Search dogs combed shoulders and drainage ditches. Volunteers pasted posters to lamp posts in the rain. Cameras in the vehicle were collected and logged. Evidence techs documented every wet footprint and every smear left by the storm. Still, the weather had already damaged much of what might have helped. Investigators focused on the things they could test. They cataloged CCTV footage from the market and from the route to the bank. They pulled phone records and checked bank logs. They logged statements from employees who had worked the night shift. Where images were clear, they preserved them. Where images were streaked, they enhanced and annotated the frames. The private camera at 1022 gave them a single blurred image of motion. It placed a vehicle on the road at the right time, but it could not identify a driver. Physical evidence surfaced in small measures. Forensic teams found a fragment of fabric on the rear seat of the car. Jake had a record of bar fights and a recent public breakup with Lisa over money. Neighbors later told reporters he began avoiding contact with people in town. He left town weeks after the disappearance. Tom's initial description of seeing Lisa leaving the lot changed in later interviews. He provided different details about his movements that night. Richard had argued with staff about cash counts in the weeks before the incident and had been under financial strain, coworkers said. Detectives listed these facts and followed them where they could. Public pressure grew fast. The local paper ran a front-page story within days. Social media amplified names and rumors. Conversations at the diner turned accusatory. One volunteer who helped post flyers recalled, "We pasted posters in the rain all night. We hoped someone would remember her face." That mix of grief and rumor shaped community opinion long before courts or labs rendered conclusions. Police worked to separate rumor from evidence. They re-interviewed witnesses and checked shift logs. They subpoenaed phone towers and bank server records. They ran fingerprints and submitted the fabric and boot samples to forensic labs. For months, the file filled with notes, exhibits, and lists of follow-ups. Yet in the early weeks, no single piece of evidence pointed directly to a suspect who could be charged. Time made the trail colder. Months passed, leads dried up. The active search moved into routine checks and annual reminders. Posters faded on poles. The case settled into a colder file. But the family kept pushing. Lisa's mother organized searches and wrote letters to officials. Detectives kept samples stored in evidence lockers, preserving what the rain had not erased. Nearly a decade later, the case shifted. Advances in forensic testing created new options. Laboratories could now amplify small amounts of biological material to generate DNA profiles where older techniques had failed. Microscopic fiber analysis improved. Forensic teams revisited the car, the fabric, and the boots. They reprocessed samples, applying methods that were not available when the rain first blurred the cameras. The new testing produced a profile from a hair fragment and matched material from the fabric scrap. That profile did not match any of the original 3 names that had dominated early suspicion. Instead, it matched a man. The discovery focused the investigation. Detectives obtained warrants and expanded searches. They checked surveillance again and found small gaps in the bank's recordings consistent with opportunities to step away from the post. They interviewed coworkers who described him as polite and presentable. None had suspected he could be involved in anything like this. When remains later surfaced after a storm lowered river levels, forensic examination connected the discovery to Lisa. Dental records and personal effects confirmed the identity. The same DNA markers found on the seats and on the recovered clothing fragments were also present on materials from the remains. The investigative narrative moved from missing person to linked evidence, and then to a suspect with forensic ties. Prosecutors assembled the sequence in a material way. The routine deposit run, the route, the weather, the blurred images, the abandoned car, the fabric fragment, the boots, the hair, the DNA match, the financial motive, and the bank guard's proximity and access. Defense counsel raised the usual challenges about contamination, chain of custody, and the effects of weather on samples. The courtroom debate centered on whether the scientific links, taken together, met the legal standard for conviction. As the trial unfolded, the names that had once been common in rumor, Jake, Tom, and Richard, were removed from the list of legal suspects. They were cleared of criminal responsibility, though not of the social cost they had paid. Jobs were lost, families strained. The stain of public suspicion lingered, even when the lab results pointed elsewhere. For the family, the admission that the remains were Lisa's brought both closure and renewed grief. They finally had answers to the central question: what had happened on the rainy night? The answers, delivered through forensic work and patient investigation, did not erase the years of uncertainty. They did, however, place the facts where they could be reviewed, argued, and judged. The case offers multiple lessons. Weather can erase or damage evidence. Routine behaviors can become risk factors when someone is watching and waiting. Public accusation can ruin lives in the absence of proof. Science can change a cold file into an active case. And sometimes the person the town trusts is the person who betrays that trust. In the next section, we will walk the timeline again, step by step. We will examine each piece of evidence in detail and show how investigators moved from initial reports to the breakthrough that changed everything. The first hours after discovery set the tone for everything that followed. Officers moved quickly. The scene was secured. Tape went up across the lot. Patrol cars ringed the perimeter. Every move aimed to protect what remained after the rain. Search teams spread out along the route Lisa would have driven. Canine units ran the shoulder and the ditch lines. Volunteers walked fields and side roads, checking culverts and fence rows. Divers stood by at low water points. The search went on into the night and resumed at first light. People from the community came with flashlights and umbrellas. They plastered flyers over lampposts, mailboxes, and storefront windows. One volunteer later said, "We pasted posters in the rain all night. We hoped someone would remember her face." That sense of urgency carried the search forward, even as the weather worked again. Cameras became the next priority. Officers extracted footage from the market and from every available source along the route. They sought images from street cameras, a private driveway camera, and any business that had a view of the road. Rain streaked across many frames. Some files were corrupted. Where images were usable, analysts synchronized timestamps and mapped vehicle movement. A private camera captured a blurred vehicle at 10:22 p.m., but the image could not identify a driver. Enhancement techniques helped clarify outlines. They could place a car on the road at the right time, but they could not yet place a person in it. Phone records and financial logs were pulled the same day. Investigators subpoenaed call histories, SMS logs, and tower pings for Lisa and for people in her circle. Bank servers were queried for any transactions that might show an attempt to deposit or spend the missing funds. Early checks found no card activity tied to the deposit after closing. That absence became a key detail. The deposit did not show up in any system that night. If the money changed hands, it did so off the books. Physical evidence outside the vehicle had to be followed. On the rear seat, technicians found a fragment of fabric. It was small, frayed, and drenched. They removed it carefully, placed it on sterile paper, and sent it to the lab for fiber and trace analysis. About 400 meters from the vehicle, a caller reported boots caught in a ditch. The officers recovered a pair of wet boots caked with mud. They photographed the scene and bagged the boots for later testing. Every item was labeled and stored cold when needed. The rain had soaked potential DNA, but modern protocols allowed recovery of traces even from compromised samples. Still, the condition of the materials demanded extra care. Witness interviews began immediately. Detectives interviewed employees on duty, the coworker who last said he saw Lisa leave, the manager who handled the deposit schedule, and staff who had handled cash that night. Family and friends were also taken through the basic timeline. One coworker, Tom, told detectives, "I saw her head down soaked through, but she walked steady. That was the last I remember." His statement, "Those divergences mattered." Initial interviews revealed inconsistencies in alibis and in small actions. Some people shifted their description of where they were at specific times. Others clarified times only after reviewing their own phone logs. Detectives categorized statements as confirmed or unconfirmed. Confirmed facts included the safe being opened at 10:05 p.m., the market closing on schedule, and the vehicle being found 3 miles down the road. Unconfirmed items included who, if anyone, had approached the car between 10:15 and 10:30, and whether anyone had been seen on foot near the drainage ditches that night. As the investigative net widened, teams were assigned clear specialties. Forensics handled fiber and potential DNA testing, and they started preservation and analysis protocols immediately. A trace evidence unit worked on the fabric fragment, examining weave patterns, dye composition, and microscopic particulates. A footwear and soil analyst examined the boots for distinctive tread marks and for soil signatures that might place them at a particular location. The technical team continued to work on enhancing video frames and cross-referencing vehicle makes and models. A financial crimes team began a soft review of accounts for anyone connected to the deposit routine. The investigative approach deliberately mixed old-school canvassing with new lab science. Legal steps followed. Detectives prepared affidavits to request search warrants where probable cause appeared. They sought court orders to get DVR footage preserved from private systems that might otherwise overwrite data. Subpoenas were served for bank logs and for workplace schedules. Any search or seizure was documented and executed under judicial oversight. Investigators knew that the integrity of their process would be tested later in court, so proper procedure was not optional, it was central. Even as they built the case file, the team faced tangible obstacles. The rain had smeared key images and washed away surface traces. Footprints lacked clarity. DNA, when present, was degraded or present in tiny amounts. Families and community members demanded quick answers, and the press ran with names and innuendo. That pressure, forensics sent the initial samples to the lab with a clear list of tests: fiber analysis, mitochondrial and nuclear DNA screening where possible, and comparison to known reference samples from household items if provided. The goal was to determine whether the fabric on the seat matched any known garment, and whether DNA traces could identify an individual. The boot treads would be compared against databases and any known footwear linked to persons of interest. Each test came with caveats about contamination and degradation. The lab results would be preliminary at first, then refined as more sophisticated techniques were applied. Investigators also pursued the human side of the timeline. They rechecked shift handovers and time cards for the night. They mapped who had access to the safe and who routinely handled deposit runs. They asked the bank to provide records of employees on duty that night and to preserve any footage that covered the bank entrance. The aim was to reconstruct places and access points. The deposit routine, who handled the bag, who had keys, who was nearby, was not a peripheral detail. It was central to understanding opportunities and access. Over the following weeks, leads were prioritized. Forensics results could take time, so detectives focused on timelines and contradictions they could verify quickly. They re-interviewed witnesses with specific, narrow questions. They checked surveillance for other vehicles that could correlate with the private camera image. They canvassed businesses along the route for dash camera footage. They ran license plate searches on any plate numbers that matched the car profile seen at 10:22 p.m. At each step, the case record grew thicker. Evidence logs filled with entries noting when items were collected, who handled them, and where they were stored. The list of potential leads expanded and contracted as checks returned positive or negative. Detectives updated supervisors regularly and prepared briefing packages for the prosecutor's office. If probable cause emerged for a specific person, they planned to pursue arrest and to seek the necessary warrants to support that step. Despite these efforts, the file contained clear gaps. The private camera's frame could not identify a driver. The rain complicated DNA recovery and raised questions about the viability of certain samples. Several alibis were weak but not provably false. There was no immediate witness who had seen an interaction involving the deposit bag being taken. Those gaps framed the next phase of inquiry. Next steps were practical and methodical. Forensics remained the top priority. DNA and fiber results would be pushed through the most advanced tests available. Analysts would compare fiber weaves, dye, and thread composition against known garments or coats. DNA profiles, if viable, would be entered into national databases for potential matches. Technicians would also attempt mitochondrial DNA testing when nuclear profiles were insufficient. At the same time, investigators would continue to verify timelines, check financial records for irregular activity, and re-interview anyone whose story had shifted. The work that began at the wet parking lot was careful, detailed, and unglamorous. It relied on forms, chain of custody logs, and patient lab work. It also depended on ordinary police work, knocking on doors, cross-checking times, and keeping records precise. The combination of technical analysis and persistent canvassing would ultimately change the direction of the case. But at this stage, in the first days after the discovery, the investigation rested on a narrow set of physical items, a handful of stretched CCTV frames, and a string of witness statements that pointed to too many questions and too few answers. As the team closed this chapter of fieldwork and evidence collection, they prepared to move forward. The next phase would focus on analysis, on the laboratory work that could turn fragments into leads, and on the interviews that might fill the remaining blanks in the timeline. What began as a search became an investigation. What remained was the work of connecting those early pieces to a person or persons who could explain that rainy night. 3 people stood at the center of the story that followed Lisa's disappearance. Each had a connection to her life. Each had reasons someone. Jake told officers where he had been the night Lisa vanished. His story was that he worked late and then went straight home. A few coworkers gave rough confirmations, but none could pin him to an exact minute between 10 and 11. His alibi was soft. Detectives noted the gap and kept asking for corroboration. They checked time cards and crew rosters. They pulled phone pings. Nothing placed him on the road near the market at 10:15 p.m. There was no DNA or physical evidence tying Jake to the car or to the deposit bag. Forensics did not find his DNA in the vehicle. He did not match the hair or fabric samples that would later become meaningful. Still, his behavior after the disappearance raised eyebrows. Friends said he left town a few weeks later. People who had known him for years began to avoid him. A former neighbor told a reporter, "He kept to himself after that. We didn't know what to say." That withdrawal only fed rumors. Next came Tom Harris. Tom was younger. He worked the same night shift as Lisa. He was the last employee to say he saw her leave the lot. That fact made him a critical witness. He described the scene in a way that placed a human presence with Lisa as she walked out into the rain. "I saw her head down, soaked through," he told detectives. "But she walked steady. That was the last I remember." His words carried weight. They also carried limits. Tom's account changed in small ways over repeated interviews. He first said he had been stacking carts outside. Later, he said he had been in the stockroom. He corrected times after looking at his phone records. Those inconsistencies worried detectives. They have to account for the effect of stress, weather, and time on memory. Investigators logged each change and asked follow-up questions. Tom had no solid alibi verified by an independent witness for the window between 10 and 10:30. That gap was enough to place him under scrutiny. Physical traces added to the suspicion around Tom, though they were weak. Forensic teams recovered dust and a small fiber sample on his work shoes that matched the general type of material on the raincoat fragment from the rear seat. The match was not unique. It was not proof. Analysts recorded it as a lead, not as a link. The store terminated his employment weeks after the disappearance. He lost income and faced public scorn. Some people in town said he avoided them in the grocery aisle. That social pressure became part of his story as much as any forensic note. The third person investigators examined closely was Richard Gomez, the night manager. He oversaw tills and handled deposit procedures. He assigned employees to the deposit run and signed off on the paperwork. That role put him in the paper trail. It also put him under a microscope when the deposit bag went missing. Coworkers described recent sharp exchanges between Richard and Lisa about cash counts. Several staff members heard heated words. Some reported that Richard was under financial strain. Detectives checked payroll, loan notices, and public records for signs of pressure. They found indications of mounting bills, though nothing that proved a plan to steal or to harm. Richard's explanation for the night was straightforward. He had been in the back completing reports after close. One employee said she saw him at the office computer until after 10:30. Another said she had not seen him leave the floor that evening. Richard's alibi had supporters, but also questions. Time logs showed him on site, but camera coverage of the back entrance had gaps. Rain had obscured key angles on exterior cameras. Investigators flagged discrepancies in the timeline and obtained his bank records for review. There was no forensic evidence directly connecting him to the vehicle or to physical traces in the car. Still, the combination of conflict over cash counts and financial stresses made him a person of interest in the early days. When investigators laid the three profiles side by side, patterns and gaps emerged. Each man had a motive of sorts. Jake had anger and a public breakup. Tom had proximity and shifting memory. Richard had control over the deposit process and financial pressure. At the same time, the shortcomings of early evidence were obvious. Video from the market was streaked by rain. A private driveway camera showed motion at 10:22 p.m., but it could not identify a driver or make. Phone records showed no activity that tied the deposit bag to any bank transaction. The car had been left 3 miles away with keys in the ignition, but there were no clear signs of a struggle inside. Forensic teams recovered a small fabric fragment and a pair of wet boots 400 meters from the vehicle. Those items were important. They were also compromised by the weather. The rain washed DNA and blurred marks. Lab technicians cautioned that any results would need careful interpretation. Public pressure shaped the way the three men were treated outside the investigation room. The local press printed names early and loudly. Social media spread speculation fast. Neighbors pointed fingers. Someone taped a sign at a gas station with questions and accusations. The social fallout was immediate and sharp. Jake left town under a cloud. Tom lost his job and felt the strain at home. Richard began drinking more, friends said, and his marriage frayed. These consequences underscore a grim reality. Being suspected has effects, even if a person is never charged. Jobs vanish, reputations erode, families fracture. Detectives were aware of this. They recognized the danger of letting rumor lead the work. Still, they had to answer the same pressing questions the public demanded. Who had motive, and who had opportunity? Investigative strategy shifted accordingly. Detectives pursued corroboration for every alibi and every claim that had been made. They subpoenaed time cards and roster logs. They pulled bank statements and cross-checked withdrawals for anyone with a plausible financial motive. They asked for DVR footage from nearby businesses and searched for dashcam recordings from delivery trucks that drove along the route that night. They re-interviewed witnesses with narrow, fact-focused questions, asking for times, locations, and who else was present. Forensics remained the key path out of ambiguity. Fiber analysis could show whether the fragment from the rear seat came from a coat similar to one owned by a suspect. Soil and tread analysis on the boots could place a wearer at a particular place. DNA testing, where possible, could provide a link that hearsay could not. The lab work took time. It required patience and controls. The investigators did not rush the chain of custody. Every sample was documented, sealed, and logged. Investigators also considered the broader context. Who knew the deposit routines? Who had routine access to the bank or to the route Lisa took? That line of questioning opened other doors. It suggested opportunities that extended beyond the three men everyone talked about in the diner. Detectives flagged employees at the bank and drivers who made late-night runs through the area. The inquiry began to widen while still keeping pressure on the three most immediately connected individuals. Despite the widening net, the team remained careful about language and public statements. They distinguished between being a person of interest and being a suspect in a chargeable sense. They emphasized unconfirmed versus confirmed facts in briefings. Prosecutors were kept informed as results arrived from labs. If probable cause emerged against any individual, they planned the legal steps and warrants necessary to proceed. As weeks passed, The most immediate truth about the three men was simple and stark. Each had been closely examined. Each had elements that aroused suspicion. None had immediate conclusive proof against them at that early stage. The public reaction had already punished many in practical ways. The investigation kept moving, step by step, from interviews and canvassing to careful scientific work. The following chapter of the case would move from who was suspected to why. It would test the limits of early alibis and explore the small physical clues that might connect a person to a place. For now, the record held open questions. A fabric fragment awaiting comparison. Boot treads waiting for a match. Phone pings waiting for a pattern. The work ahead would be technical and methodical. It would also bring into sharp relief how quickly suspicion can alter lives. Even before science, the story left the town with questions that were louder than answers. Within a day, the headlines had names. Within a week, the rumor mill ran faster than the investigation. Reporters camped at the market. Social posts spread screenshots and guesses. That noise changed how people saw each other. It changed how the investigation felt on the ground. In the first 48 hours, local news printed speculation. Online threads named possible suspects. Viewers called talk shows with their theories. The coverage pushed the case into public view before the lab had finished its first tests. Editors chased clicks. Commenters chased certainty. That appetite for a quick story put pressure on a slow process that depends on proof. Social media amplified impressions into judgment. Posts accused, reposted, and piled on. A single rumor could reach hundreds in minutes. People who worked at the store reported messages and whispers. Employees received texts from strangers asking questions. Neighbors pointed fingers. The town square that had once shared baking recipes now hosted accusations. That public trial carried consequences outside any courtroom. Those consequences were immediate for several people who found themselves named again and again. Jake Miller, the ex-boyfriend, left town soon after the incident. He stopped answering calls. Friends said he could not handle the attention. Tom Harris lost his job at the market. Customers avoided him on runs to the grocery store. Richard Gomez, the manager, drank more and argued at home. He was suspended and later fired. The suspicion did not need proof to wreck a life. A reputation can be damaged by rumor as effectively as by fact. The family of the missing woman bore a different weight. They had to stay visible and persistent. They put up posters in the rain. They spoke to reporters and answered calls from volunteers. They organized searches on cold weekends. "We pasted posters in the rain all night," one volunteer remembered. "We hoped someone would remember her face." That work kept the case alive in the town's memory, but it also exposed the family to intrusive questions and to the same rumors sweeping the community. Investigators also felt the personal pressure. Supervisors received calls from local leaders demanding quick results. Officers were asked to explain steps they could not yet complete. The prosecutor's office watched lab timelines and questioned priorities. Detectives did not welcome shortcuts. They knew mistakes in the early days could doom a later prosecution. But the public clamor shaped priorities and added urgency to decisions that would normally follow the pace of evidence. Rumor and pressure created practical problems for the work itself. Witnesses sometimes changed their minds because of what they read online. People who had been willing to speak at first became hesitant under public scrutiny. Some withdrew cooperation out of fear of being targeted or misquoted. That withdrawal reduced the number of independent confirmations the team could gather. Every missing eyewitness made it harder to reconstruct the night. Technical issues made the investigation harder too. The rain had blurred key camera footage. Footprints and small traces had washed away. Samples taken early were often wet and compromised. Forensics teams described the materials as salvageable but fragile. Lab work required extra care. Tests that might have been routine in dry conditions demanded more resources and time. The weather had done the first damage. The second hit came from the rush to make sense of the scene before tests could provide answers. The community response also created a secondary layer of expense. The market faced reputation damage and a dip in customers. The owner had to manage media and staff complaints. Local businesses that saw their employees named in threads shed business and staff morale. Volunteers and neighbors spent hours helping to search and to post flyers. Those hours were unpaid. They were emotional investments that families and neighbors were asked to make while living their own lives. Social consequences reached further than the immediate suspects. Teachers received questions from students. Coaches were asked about players who might be implicated. Past acquaintances were contacted by outsiders seeking context or gossip. The ripple effect touched people who had no involvement beyond a passing connection. That broad net made the town feel smaller and more exposed at the same time. For the men who were publicly suspected, the effect was rapid and severe. Jake's work prospects vanished in the region. Tom's family faced harassment in the neighborhood. Richard's marriage strained under the weight of rumor and stress. The legal record at that point said nothing conclusive, but the social record had changed. In most cases, the community's verdict arrived long before any courtroom decision. Police took steps to separate public opinion from the evidence. They issued periodic updates that kept the basic facts in circulation without disclosing sensitive details. They asked the public for tips and for restraint. They warned against spreading unverified claims. Those requests found mixed responses. Some residents complied. Others continued to post and to circulate theories. Managing that tension took time away from core investigative work. As initial leads dried up, the active search phase slowed. Investigators moved from continuous canvassing to targeted follow-ups. The case file grew with notes, evidence logs, and lab requests. Yet the pace felt different. The daily frenzy of search parties and media vans faded. The case entered a quieter phase where months, not days, marked progress. That quiet did not mean the case was forgotten by all, but it did mean the sense of years passed. Some leads ran cold. Funding and personnel priorities shifted to other active cases. The file became what law enforcement calls a cold case, not closed, but not actively solvable with the resources at hand. That shift from hot file to cold file had technical and human reasons. Technically, degraded samples and blurred footage limited what labs could do with early methods. Humanly, witnesses moved away, memories faded, and the town moved forward with daily life. Yet cold did not mean abandoned. The investigators maintained the evidence, mindful that science changes. They held the items in storage, recorded their locations, and safeguarded chain of custody documentation. Officers archived digital files carefully, including copies of every CCTV clip and every interview transcript. The work of preservation was intentional. It was an investment in the possibility of future breakthroughs. Meanwhile, the family never stopped pushing. They organized small searches each year. They called detectives to ask for updates. They answered questions from journalists with a controlled grief and determination. "We won't stop looking," the mother said in a taped appeal. Those public reminders kept the case on a long horizon. They also reminded the town that unresolved loss ripples through years, not days. The social record of the event remained complicated. For some, the memory was of a messy public conversation that had hurt innocent people. For others, it was a call to vigilance and community action. Either way, the episode reshaped relationships. Long-standing friendships frayed. Neighborhood trust eroded. People learned that suspicion can spread faster than evidence. They also learned that the criminal justice system requires proof, not opinion. There were practical lessons for the department as well. Command staff updated policies on public information management. They refined scripts for briefings and clarified when to request media blackouts on sensitive details. They strengthened evidence preservation protocols for wet conditions. They trained investigators to anticipate the cadence of public curiosity and to manage it with steady, fact-based communication. By the time the the good news in that shift was obvious. When active rumor dies down, laboratories and cold case units gain space to apply new tools without the pressure of instant scrutiny. The team preserved the physical items that mattered most. The fabric fragment from the car, the boots found in the ditch, swabs taken from upholstery. Those items would become the raw material of a later breakthrough if methods improved. So the case entered a long watch. Investigators scheduled regular reviews of the file. They updated the database entries when new lab techniques emerged. They left open lines of communication with the family. They accepted that the public had moved on in many ways. But they did not consider the file closed. The archive of evidence, the notes, and the memories of those who had worked the initial days remained. Those elements were the seeds of possibility. In the end, the story of public pressure and of social consequence is its own cautionary tale. Quick judgment can ruin lives. Unlimited speculation can complicate real investigation. The record shows both the harm and the hope. Harm in how many people were pushed into sudden pain, and hope in how careful preservation and tenacity kept the door open for new answers. As the immediate storm of headlines faded and the file cooled, investigators focused on one honest fact. Science evolves. What could not be proven with the tools of that rainy night might be provable years later. The next phase would rely on that possibility. New forensic methods would offer a second chance to test the preserved evidence. The following chapter of this story would show how those advances reopened lines of inquiry and redirected suspicion toward someone no one had expected. In 2021, investigators returned to a case that had sat quietly for years. New tools had arrived. Science had moved forward. The rainy night that once erased so much could no longer hide every trace. They began by asking a simple question. What evidence had we kept? The question led to an inventory. Officer choice of methods came next. The detectives and lab leaders met to select the best tools for the job. Older DNA tests had limits when samples were small or contaminated. Newer methods, more sensitive STR testing and massively parallel sequencing, could sometimes recover profiles from tiny or degraded material. Fiber analysis had also improved. Microscopy paired with chemical testing could now differentiate threads that once looked identical. Video enhancement tools could clarify a few frames of a washed-out CCTV clip, revealing shapes that had been indistinct before. Forensic genealogy was discussed as an option, depending on what kind of profile emerged. Legal steps followed each scientific decision. Where tests went beyond routine, prosecutors or magistrates reviewed affidavits and approved the work. The lab required formal requests and paperwork. That kept results admissible later. It also meant the team had to wait for court authorization in a few cases. The delay frustrated some, but the investigators accepted the process. A warrantless or poorly documented test could undo months of work. Laboratory work unfolded in stages. Technicians began with the least invasive, most promising samples. They ran multiple extractions to reduce the chance that contamination would be mistaken for a legitimate profile. They logged everything. They reported quality metrics for each run: how many alleles were detected, how complete a profile appeared, and whether any markers suggested a mixed sample. For the fabric fragment, analysts looked for both DNA and fiber characteristics. For the hair, they checked mitochondrial sequences and nuclear markers where possible. For the wet boots, they sampled the tread, the seams, and any lodged debris. Initial results were cautious. Some samples returned only partial profiles, or the kind of ambiguous data common after exposure to water. Those outputs did not go straight to arrest. They went to experts for interpretation. Forensics teams measure confidence in levels. They mark results as probative or inconclusive. In this case, a few findings moved from inconclusive to probative after repeat analysis. A hair produced a partial nuclear profile that, when a candidate profile appeared, the lab placed it into the national database. The automated system checks known offender profiles and other entries in the index. If the system finds a match above a legal threshold, it generates a lead. If not, investigators consider other options, including investigative genetic genealogy where rules permit. In this case, the partial profile produced a match in the criminal database. The name returned was not one of the three people who had dominated rumor and suspicion in the town. It was a person with access to the bank area. It was someone the community had known and trusted. The match, at first, raised as many questions as it answered. A database link establishes identity by science. It does not yet place a person at a specific time or show intent. The next steps, therefore, focused on corroboration. Detectives dug into work logs and schedules. They pulled the security guards' shift records, bank entry logs, and any maintenance notes. They requested camera footage from the bank's exterior and interior systems that might show who left the guard post and when. They served subpoenas for phone records to map tower pings during the critical window. They checked vehicle registrations and credit or withdrawal records tied to the missing deposit. Parallel to those checks, the team sought more physical evidence tied to the suspect. They searched for clothing that matched the thread found in the car. They sought footwear that might match the wet boots discovered near the scene. They requested financial records under legal compulsion, aiming to understand whether sudden payments or odd activity could indicate motive. Each new item required another round of legal authorization: search warrants for a residence or vehicle, court orders for data. The work followed a mapped legal path. The warrant process demanded a well-documented affidavit. Detectives compiled lab reports, chain of custody documentation, summaries of the database match, and an outline of corroborating investigative leads. Prosecutors reviewed the affidavit and advised on scope. Judges then evaluated probable cause. Only with those warrants in hand could officers lawfully search personal spaces and seize further evidence. Searches turned up new material. In some cases, officers recovered items that matched the fibers and debris found on the car seat. In others, they found digital logs or receipts that placed the suspect in proximity to the bank on the night in question. Each find required lab testing and careful cataloging. Analysts compared thread cross-sections under polarized light. They ran DNA tests on any biological traces and compared those sequences to the candidate profile already identified. Results that corroborated the database match strengthened the case. Results that did not required reevaluation and, at times, additional testing. Throughout this period, the investigative team managed public communications tightly. They prepared statements that confirmed a development without revealing investigative tactics or sensitive data. The public had questions. The family demanded answers. Law enforcement had to balance the need for transparency with the risk that premature disclosure would taint witnesses or alert potential accomplices. Careful messaging aimed to maintain public trust while protecting the integrity of the case. At every turn, the team kept an eye on known risks. Contamination risk remained high whenever tiny samples were handled. Chain of custody had to be flawless. Analysts kept logs and audits of who touched each item and when. Investigators expected defense attorneys to challenge anything that looked sloppy. They anticipated arguments about secondary transfer, laboratory error, or the possibility that a match in the database only showed a prior contact with the sample. That is why corroboration was not optional. DNA would be powerful, but it was not sufficient alone. By the time warrants were served and additional items seized, the evidentiary picture had become layered. Scientific data, corroborated by logs, witness statements, and physical matches, created a stronger narrative than any single test could. It was a mosaic built piece by piece. Prosecutors reviewed lab reports, the chain of custody, and the investigative timeline. They assessed whether probable cause had matured into prosecutable evidence. The decision to charge rested on the totality of this work. When the case progressed to arrest and charge, investigators, through it all, the people who had once been the focus of gossip, watched as a different sequence of events unfolded. The scientific match had shifted attention away from rumor and toward documented proof. That change did not erase the damage gossip had caused, but it redirected the official response from speculation to a process that emphasizes verification. The turning point arrived after months of coordinated work. A DNA profile derived from the preserved materials matched an individual in the national database. That match was then supported by fiber comparisons, location logs, and items seized under warrant that bore the same microscopic characteristics as the fragments found in the vehicle. The combination of genetic data and corroborating evidence provided the kind of foundation prosecutors need to move forward. Still, Investigators remained cautious in public. They emphasized that a match leads to questions that must be answered in court. Matching a profile to a person points investigators toward the next stage: motive, opportunity, and actions. It does not, by itself, prove every element of a crime. That is why the next steps were forensic checks, witness interviews, and legal processes aimed at building a full case that could withstand defense challenges. The result of this painstaking process was a shift in the case's trajectory. What had been a cold file began to feel active again. The team that had preserved evidence and followed legal protocols saw their work pay off. The science that had been unavailable on that rainy night now produced signals where once there were only questions. The scene was set for the next chapter. Investigators would test further, cross-check records, and prepare for confrontation. The match in the database was the hinge. What followed would be a careful examination of the person it identified, their movements, their finances, and any ties to the night the deposit never made it to the bank. The following phase would move from laboratory findings to legal action and, eventually, to the courtroom, where the full story would be tested under oath. For years, the investigation circled questions. Rain had washed away footprints. Cameras had been blurred by water. Witness statements conflicted. Evidence was thin. Then science offered a name. The DNA came from small samples.
Alan had worked the night shift at that branch for years. He knew the deposit schedule. He had regular access to the building and the shift patterns of staff. On paper, he was part of the backbone of the town's safety. In the hours around the disappearance, his records put him in the bank. But new analysis suggested he was also tied to the car. Physical evidence linked him to the vehicle. The fragment of fabric found on the rear seat matched fibers from a raincoat seized at Alan's home during a search conducted after the match. Fiber microscopy showed the same weave, the same color dye composition, and microscopic wear patterns. A hair recovered from the upholstery yielded a mitochondrial sequence consistent with Alan's maternal line, and nuclear DNA from the same spot matched his profile through STR markers. Forensic scientists documented concordant results across multiple assays. Experts signed affidavits explaining the statistical weight of those matches. Timeline work placed Alan in the window of opportunity. Bank logs and shift records showed he left his post briefly around 22:10 and returned around 22:35. That fits the most critical interval. Lisa left the market with a deposit bag at 22:15 and was last seen on roadway cameras near 22:22. Investigators matched those times with surveillance from the bank and GPS pings from delivery vehicles in the area. A teller recalled seeing the security gate briefly open during Alan's shift. A coworker later said, "I remember Alan stepping out that night. It was raining hard. He looked like he was taking a quick break." Those statements were small pieces, but they fit into the forensic picture. Investigators also found motive that went beyond opportunity. Financial records obtained through legal process revealed a pattern of risk. Alan had several large unexplained withdrawals and the kind of repeated transactions consistent with gambling losses. Bank auditors noted irregular payments on a personal account under review. Those records did not prove intent, but they established context, pressure, a need for cash, and frequent access to the place where deposit runs ended. Arrest did not happen without legal steps. Once the DNA match emerged, detectives compiled a detailed affidavit. They listed lab results, chain of custody. The arrest itself was calm. Officers took Alan into custody without incident. He was read his rights and transported to the county station. Early reports quoted a brief statement from investigators. "We have a match and we have a warrant. We will let the evidence speak."
Alan invoked his right to counsel and declined to answer detailed questions at that time. That reaction is standard and expected. Legal counsel later confirmed he would contest the evidence. The community reacted the way small towns do when the familiar becomes suspect. Lisa's family demanded answers. Her mother issued a short statement heard across local news. "We want the truth. We want justice for Lisa." Neighbors and coworkers expressed shock. Many struggled to accept that a person who checked keys and watched night shifts could be linked to the scene. At the same time, the three people who had been under public suspicion for years felt a shift. Jake, Tom, and Richard, whose lives were upended by rumors and accusation, watched as attention turned. For some, the change brought relief. For others, it reopened wounds. One former colleague said quietly, "We waited years for something solid. Now the labs have given us a direction." The transition from suspicion based on behavior and proximity to forensic identification changed both the legal posture and the conversation in town. Investigators moved quickly to corroborate the match. DNA on its own is powerful, but courts expect corroboration. Detectives checked phone records. Alan's phone showed location pings consistent with time near the route Lisa drove. A forensic enhancement of a grainy video near the riverbank showed a figure in a dark coat at a time that matched the phone pings. Footwear impressions found near the roadside contained a tread pattern similar to a pair of boots recovered from Alan's garage. Soil recovered from the soles matched the composition of the roadside shoulder where the vehicle was later found. Experts completed comparative tests on scuff marks and microscopic paint transfer. Each additional data point strengthened the link. The defense predictable points were anticipated and addressed. Attorneys for Alan raised standard challenges. They questioned possible contamination of samples, potential errors during evidence handling, and the prosecutors also widened the investigation. They subpoenaed bank entry logs, employee timesheets, and security footage from additional angles. They requested transaction histories tied to suspicious withdrawals. They interviewed coworkers, asking about unusual behavior, late-night departures, and any conversations about money troubles. They checked external records for gambling activity and for other debts that might explain a motive. All of this work fed into the legal strategy. The prosecution prepared to show how opportunity, motive, and physical evidence combined to form a coherent narrative. Defense counsel prepared to attack each piece. The technical reports were central. Lab directors prepared to testify about the testing methods. Fiber specialists drafted statements explaining microscopic comparisons. Digital forensic analysts prepared timelines integrating phone tower data with CCTV frames. There were limits. Rain had altered the scene. Some camera frames remained unusable. Memory is not perfect. Witnesses offered conflicting accounts in places. Still, the new forensic data closed gaps that the weather had left open. The match was not a single flash of proof. It was a layer of science plus circumstance. For legal purposes, that composite would be tested in court. Public statements reflected a careful tone. Police emphasized facts: the match, the warrants, the seizures. Prosecutors cautioned that an arrest is not a conviction. Defense lawyers reminded the public of the presumption of innocence. That balance is part of the system. But the evidence changed the practical reality of the case. An investigation that had leaned on suspicion now had concrete threads for a prosecution. As preparations for charges progressed, Investigators continued to gather supporting material. They re-interviewed employees who worked with Allen that night. Some recall seeing him with wet cuffs or a torn edge on a raincoat. Others could not remember details amid the storm. Investigators tracked small, physical traces: a smear on a metal railing at the bank, a fiber on a garbage bag collected during the search, the specific pattern of waterborne debris near a drainage culvert. Each trace was... The community response was complicated. Lisa's family wanted the case to end with accountability. For the town at large, the revelation that a trusted security officer could be implicated raised broader questions about how public roles are policed and about how trust can be abused. At the same time, those who had been publicly shamed earlier in the investigation took tentative steps to reclaim their lives. The case had long ago leaked into social media, where speculation had produced its own narrative. Now, with legal processes underway, the court of law would have the central voice. In practical terms, the arrest transformed the file from a cold inquiry into an active prosecution. Investigators and prosecutors now focused on evidence admissibility, on sober, replicable science, and on building a clear timeline for trial. The aim was not to dramatize the town's pain. The aim was to present a case the jury could evaluate. The final point before the courtroom was this: science pointed to a person. It did so through careful testing, repeated verification, and independent confirmation. That scientific signal fit a broader pattern of opportunity, access, and financial pressure. Investigators acted on that combination. They obtained warrants. They made an arrest. The following steps would be legal proceedings, expert testimony, and cross-examination. The law would weigh what labs and timelines had found. With the suspect in custody and case files stacked, the matter moved from lab reports to courtroom preparation. The next chapter would test whether scientific matches coupled with corroborating facts were sufficient to secure justice for Lisa. The case moved from the street to the courthouse. What began as a missing person call became a criminal trial. The question was simple and heavy. Could the science and the law close this chapter? Prosecutors filed formal charges. The list included robbery and homicide. The indictment came after the cold case unit submitted new forensic reports. The prosecutor's goal was clear. They needed to link motive, opportunity, and the physical evidence. They laid out a timeline and said the evidence would follow. The courtroom felt strict and small. Forensic experts then took the stand. A DNA analyst explained the lab process in plain terms. The profile matches to a statistically significant degree, the analyst said. The expert described careful chain of custody procedures and independent verification steps. Fiber analysts testified about weave patterns and dye matches. A digital forensics specialist explained how low-quality video frames were enhanced and time-synced. The experts also noted limits. They explained the possibility of contamination and the measures taken to prevent it. They gave the court the numbers and the caveats. Witness testimony followed. A bank teller described routine night shifts and confirmed a guard's presence near the deposit area on the night in question. A coworker testified about the last known sighting at the grocery parking lot. I remember saying goodbye. It was raining hard. That image stayed with me, the coworker told the court. A responding officer described the condition of the abandoned car and the items collected at the scene. Each witness filled gaps and added context around the physical traces. The defense sought to fracture that chain. Their strategy focused on doubt. They argued that trace evidence can move by accident. They questioned handling of items and the integrity of small samples taken in wet conditions. They raised the possibility of secondary transfer and human error. Defense counsel pushed on lab protocols and asked for alternate explanations for phone pings and enhanced imagery. The message was consistent. Room for reasonable doubt remained. Cross-examinations sharpened the fight. The judge allowed pointed questions about methods and margins of error. The defense drilled into storage logs and the exact wording of lab reports. The prosecutors pressed witnesses on specific timings and the consistency of their statements. In one tense exchange, a defense lawyer asked whether a faint fiber could have come from an item that briefly passed through the vehicle at another time. The expert replied that while low-level transfer is possible, the combination of DNA and fiber evidence made coincidence unlikely. Family members sat through it all. The legal outcome had practical consequences. A conviction meant a lengthy prison term, restitution orders, and limits on appeal. For those who had been publicly suspected and later cleared, the record did not instantly restore lost jobs or reputations. The social cost remained real. Several people who had been shunned by neighbors or lost careers still carried those marks. The trial addressed guilt and punishment. It did not erase the months or years of suspicion they had already suffered. At the procedural level, the case reinforced a few hard lessons for the investigators and the courts. First, meticulous preservation of evidence matters. The steps taken years later to re-examine samples made a difference. Second, forensic techniques evolve. What was inconclusive a decade earlier became central to a conviction after new methods and cautious corroboration were applied. Third, public pressure can complicate investigations. It drove scrutiny and urgency, but it also created noise that investigators had to manage carefully. After the trial, change followed. The victim's family organized advocacy efforts for better evidence preservation in local departments. Police units updated protocols for storing wet or degraded samples. The bank implemented stricter checks for staff access to secure areas and tightened reporting for off-duty movement. The county allocated funds for cold case review and prioritized training on maintaining chain of custody documentation. Local community groups launched education campaigns about how to support victims without rushing to judgment. Those were not grand reforms, but they were practical ones. They aimed to reduce the risk of evidence loss and to protect people from destructive public speculation. The family's life changed, too. They founded a small nonprofit focused on missing persons and victim support. They helped fund thermal storage for local evidence and offered workshops for families navigating long investigations. Neighbors who once avoided them returned to offer help. Small tokens of normalcy came back, slowly. A meal brought to the house, a volunteer helping with a memorial, a teacher adding a scholarship in Lisa's name. The law changed where it could. The county prosecutor's office set up a dedicated cold case team with the authority to request federal lab resources faster. The bank altered its policies about night shift logistics and employee finance checks. These measures did not undo the loss. They did, however, reduce the chance that other families would have to wait as long for answers. The courtroom taught a final lesson. Forensic science can point the way. It rarely stands alone. Good prosecutions combine science with witness evidence, records, and careful police work. Defense teams remind us that the law protects against rushes to judgment. The community learns that accusations can destroy lives before any verdict is reached. Those are hard lessons, but they are necessary. Justice in this case was neither swift nor simple. It was the product of persistent laboratory work, careful legal process, and a family that refused to let the file sit untouched. The verdict closed one chapter. The work that followed, policy changes, evidence handling improvements, community education, aimed to make other chapters different. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Hit like and share this video to help spread awareness about the importance of good evidence practices and responsible reporting. Leave a comment with questions or suggestions for future episodes. Your support helps us make more videos like this, explore cold cases, and highlight how science and law work together to find the truth.